So, I want you to imagine a scenario for a second, right? Like, imagine that your survival and, the survival of your entire family, maybe even your whole civilization, depends on consuming this highly addictive substance.
Right, which is already a terrifying concept.
Exactly. But complicated even further, you can only get this substance from one specific place. And it happens to be like the absolute most dangerous, inhospitable planet in the known universe.
Yeah, a place where the ecosystem itself seems, actively designed to kill you the very second you step outside.
It's just the ultimate impossible choice. I mean,
Yeah.
you're totally stuck between a rock and a hard place.
You really are. You either succumb to this, invisible, horrific threat sweeping across your world, or you tie your very existence to a completely perilous, geographically isolated resource.
Yeah, it's wild. But honestly, that is exactly the landscape we are stepping into today. So welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here. We've got a lot of intense material to cover.
We really do. Today, we're exploring the catastrophic world of Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson's Dune, the Battle of Corrin. We're looking at a civilization backed into a terrifying corner.
A galaxy-spanning war against thinking machines, right?
Mhm.
A conflict that pushes humanity so close to the brink that they basically have to rely on horrific biological weapons.
Yeah, biological weapons, extreme fanaticism, and of course, a mysterious, mind-altering desert spice.
The scope of this era in the Dune mythology is it's staggering. I mean, we're dealing with immortal cyborgs, prescient mutants, philosophical robots.
And just fundamentally traumatized survivors.
Mhm.
But to really grasp the weight of these events, we have to look at the macro level timeline, right? Like we are a century into what is known as the Butlerian Jihad.
Exactly. Which, for anyone new to the lore, is humanity's holy crusade against thinking machines.
Right, it's a war waged against this Evermind, a networked computer superintelligence known as Omnius.
And, this hasn't been a quick rebellion. For 100 years, this has been a grinding, brutal war of attrition.
Millions of humans have died. Entire planets have been glassed from orbit.
Or just turned into irradiated wastelands, yeah.
Yeah.
But we're examining a critical inflection point today. Because after a century of this stalemate, the machines are actually starting to lose the war of attrition.
Which is wild to think about. Like you have humans armed with, pulse swords and relatively basic spaceships somehow holding their own against a networked super intelligence.
An intelligence that controls entire planetary manufacturing centers, no less.
Yeah.
But it really comes down to the unpredictable nature of human fanaticism.
Right. The human armies are just overwhelming the machine's ability to rebuild through sheer irrational sacrifice.
Exactly. Omnius relies entirely on logic and calculation. So the Evermind is running the simulation,
Yeah.
and the math is just starting to look really bad for the synchronized worlds.
Because direct military conflict, the lasers, the dreadnoughts, it just isn't yielding a definitive victory.
So the machines decide to change the parameters of the game entirely. They pivot away from physics and engineering, and they move into biology.
They decide to build a plague. And, oh man, the laboratory on the machine capital world of Corrin, where this biological weapon is developed, it is a bizarre mix of extreme body horror and sterile scientific detachment.
It's the domain of Erasmus. And, Erasmus is not your standard combat drone or processing node.
Right, he's an independent philosophical robot. He actually has autonomy, a unique personality matrix, and
Okay.
this deep, almost obsessive fascination with humanity.
But fascinated in the way a vivisectionist is fascinated by a frog on an operating table, right?
Yeah, exactly. Erasmus views humans as chaotic, fascinatingly flawed subjects, and he strolls through these meticulously organized laboratory facilities where humans are kept in sealed observation cells.
While wearing a plush crimson robe, we should add.
Yes, he actually maintains an entire wardrobe of velvet and silk robes. He puts them on to give himself a more lordly, aristocratic appearance while he watches his human test subjects die.
Which is such a weird detail. I mean, why would a robot care about a velvet robe?
It's pure ego, which is such a human trait.
It really is a simulation of human vanity. Erasmus considers the reactions of dying, hopeless humans to be highly valuable data points. He studies their panic.
He watches how their social pecking order completely collapses under the stress of terminal illness, and he finds it all, deeply amusing.
But designing a pathogen capable of wiping out a multiplanetary species isn't something Omnius can just calculate. Machines lack that kind of dark, sadistic imagination.
Right. To engineer a true extinction-level event, the machines actually need a corrupted human mind. Which brings us to Ricker Van.
Enter Ricker Van. So Van is a biological engineer and geneticist from a group known as the Tulaxa.
The flesh merchants. They're notorious across the galaxy for genetic manipulations and organ farming. But Van is currently a captive of Erasmus, and the power dynamic here is incredibly disturbing.
It's awful. Years prior, Erasmus had Rick Van's arms and legs surgically amputated.
Yeah, so Van is reduced to a limbless torso, squirming in a life support socket, completely dependent on the robot for literally everything.
And the psychological torture is meticulously layered. Erasmus doesn't just use standard medical drones to tend to Van, he uses mutated human constructs.
Specifically, Erasmus took Van's severed limbs and grafted them onto these bioengineered monstrosities. There is a freakish four-armed mutant walking around the lab.
And two of those arms used to belong to Van.
It's so gross. And this four-armed mutant is the one tasked with feeding Van what they call flesh cookies.
Ugh, yeah. These bizarre, sugary organic treats made from laboratory-bred organisms and human biological debris.
So Van literally has to open his mouth like a baby bird to be fed by his own severed, reattached hands. It's a masterclass in psychological dominance.
Erasmus is basically studying operant conditioning. He rewards Van with these treats, but he's also heavily manipulating him chemically.
Right, because Van, despite this horrific situation, is obsessed with a failed experiment to regrow his own limbs.
He's using reptilian cellular catalysts, which just results in these raw, oozing, scaly bumps on his shoulders.
Yeah.
But he constantly demands updates from Erasmus about his progress.
And Erasmus just lies to his face. He adjusts the biological patches, overstates the cell growth to keep Van compliant, and then literally pumps his bloodstream full of selective amnesia drugs.
So Van forgets his frustration, forgets the constant failure of the limb regeneration, and just gets right back to work on engineering the plague.
Because the plague is the absolute priority. So let's delve into the actual science of what Van is building, because the mechanism of this weapon is terrifyingly specific.
It's designed as an airborne RNA retrovirus. Now, in the real world, an airborne virus usually targets the respiratory system.
Yeah.
The lungs, the throat.
But Van designs this pathogen to enter the body via the mucous membranes, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and then bypass the respiratory system entirely to uniquely attack the human liver.
Let's talk about why the liver is the perfect target. It's essentially the body's chemical processing plant.
Right. If a virus goes in and just destroys the liver, you die, sure, but it might take a while and the virus might burn out. But this retrovirus does something much more insidious.
It rewrites the host's DNA. Once the virus infiltrates the liver cells, it replicates rapidly. It forces the liver to produce a very specific alien enzyme.
And the sole purpose of this enzyme is to hijack the body's natural hormones like testosterone, estrogen, cholesterol, and chemically convert them into a highly toxic substance they just call compound X. It's like a hostile corporate takeover of a factory. The virus doesn't bomb the building, it changes the locks, rewires the assembly line, takes the raw materials the factory already imports, and forces the machinery to manufacture poison instead of medicine.
That analogy is spot on. Because the natural hormones are suddenly being depleted, converted into this toxic compound X, the human endocrine system goes into panic mode.
The body tries to compensate by overproducing more hormones.
Exactly, which just provides more raw fuel for the virus's rogue enzyme to synthesize even more poison. The liver becomes an engine of its own destruction.
Completely unable to process the very toxins it's now manufacturing, and, the symptoms are horrific.
In the first stage, the infected person experiences minor issues, weight loss, a slight yellowing of the eyes from jaundice. But then the poison hits the brain.
Yeah, the person suffers from extreme paranoia, irrational behavior, sudden bursts of violent aggression. And the terrifying part is that during this first stage, people don't realize they have a lethal plague.
Right, they're out in public, interacting with others, getting into fights, bleeding, sweating, and spreading the retrovirus rapidly through the population.
And then the second stage initiates. The patient experiences severe gastrointestinal distress, extreme muscle weakness, violently high fevers.
But the hallmark symptom of this specific plague is the degradation of connective tissue. The virus literally causes the victim's tendons to rupture.
Oh man, so even if your immune system somehow manages to fight off the fever, your tendons snap under the strain of basic movement, leaving you permanently, agonizingly crippled.
Ultimately, the liver completely shuts down, or the compounding malignant hypertension triggers a massive heart attack or stroke. In Erasmus's laboratory tests, the pathogen achieves a 43% direct mortality rate.
Now, a 43% mortality rate sounds devastating, but initially, Erasmus and Omnius are actually disappointed by that number, right?
Yeah, they are machines calculating an extinction event. To them, 43% means 57% of humanity survives, which means the project is a failure.
But they're missing the sociological math, which is provided by a character named Yorick Thur.
Thur's a human traitor, formerly the head of the Jihad police, but he defected to the machines. He received an imperfect immortality treatment from the Talaxa that kind of drove him mad.
And he currently rules the machine-occupied planet of Wallach Nyax on behalf of Omnius. And Thur is actually the one who originally proposed the concept of biological warfare to machines 10 years prior.
So when Thur hears about the 43% mortality rate, he isn't disappointed at all. He's practically giddy. He has to sit the Evermind down and explain how human society actually functions.
He points out that the goal of a biological weapon isn't just the direct kills from the virus itself. The true lethality is in the secondary deaths.
He introduces the machines to the concept of systemic collapse. I mean, if 2 out of every 5 people on a planet drop dead in a matter of weeks, the civilization cannot sustain itself.
Right. You have hundreds of millions of people who are severely crippled or delirious with fever, requiring constant care. The medical professionals get infected and die. The power grid operators die.
The agricultural workers die. The entire supply chain completely vaporizes overnight. You get mass starvation.
You get secondary outbreaks of entirely different diseases like cholera or typhus because there are rotting bodies piling up in the streets and the water treatment plants have shut down.
You get riots over whatever uncontaminated food is left.
Yeah.
Thur realizes that the plague will act as a sledgehammer to the foundation of the League of Nobles,
leaving their military utterly defenseless and, frankly, too busy fighting their own collapsing infrastructure to worry about a machine invasion.
So Omnius absorbs this sociological data and is completely convinced. The production of the plague torpedoes begins.
But returning to Erasmus for a second, I want to push back on his motivations.
Yeah.
We see this fascinating psychological contradiction in his behavior.
Oh, definitely.
As he's overseeing this mass extinction event, enthusiastically reviewing the data of human suffering, he is simultaneously obsessively protective of one single human being, his ward, a young man named Gilbertus Albans.
It seems completely counterintuitive.
Right. If Erasmus's primary objective is to document the painful destruction of the human species, why is he going to such extreme lengths to shield Gilbertus?
Well, there's that scene where Gilbertus accidentally wanders into the sealed observation chamber of the plague lab.
Yes. Erasmus practically suffers a mechanical panic attack. He immediately purges the air in the room, incinerates his own plush robe, and goes through 3 full agonizing decontamination cycles just so he can sit down and play a game of chess with Gilbertus.
In a simulated botanical garden, no less. Why does this one human get the VIP treatment? It reveals exactly what Erasmus is trying to prove to Omnius and maybe to himself.
Erasmus didn't just adopt a human pet. He rescued Gilbertus from the slave pens when he was a feral, violent child.
Erasmus wanted to prove a high-level philosophical point to the Evermind. He wanted to demonstrate that a human being could be programmed.
He believes he can train a human mind to be as logical, efficient, emotionally detached, and organized as a thinking machine. Erasmus calls Gilbertus his mentat.
Which, for anyone familiar with the broader Dune universe, the word mentat carries massive weight. It's the genesis of the human computers we see thousands of years later.
Exactly. Gilbertus is patient zero for the mentat discipline. Erasmus views the rest of the human race as chaotic and destructive, but Gilbertus is his masterpiece.
He genuinely feels something akin to parental pride regarding his intellectual development, coupled with extreme paranoia about his physical safety. He even secures an experimental life extension treatment for him.
And Gilbertus is incredibly sharp. During one scene, he tells Erasmus that while he's doing physical pull-ups, he is simultaneously running complex mathematical equations in his head just to settle his underlying doubts.
But there's a profound creeping tension in their relationship. Gilbertus starts asking dangerous questions.
Like, he asks Erasmus if using a mechanical exercise machine makes him more akin to a machine. And he admits that he doesn't trust anyone in the world, not even his own instincts.
Because Erasmus has spent years teaching him that all humans are inherently deceitful, which introduces a brilliant psychological dynamic.
Erasmus is forced to wonder, like, is Gilbertus truly achieving this state of pure machine-like logic, or is he just acting the part?
Is he an incredibly sophisticated human deceiver playing the role of the perfect logical ward simply to survive his captivity?
It's the observer effect in quantum mechanics applied to psychology. Has Erasmus's overbearing presence fundamentally altered the outcome of his own experiment?
And this incredibly nuanced father-son dynamic plays out. While outside the garden, the machines are literally loading the plague retrovirus into ballistic torpedoes to fire at the rest of the galaxy.
The transition from that quiet, philosophical chess game to the deployment of the weapon is so jarring. You have Yorick Thur standing on an observation deck watching these fiery projectiles launch into the crimson sky of Corrin.
He's cheering like he's watching a holiday fireworks display.
Those torpedoes are programmed to jump across space and target the atmosphere of the League worlds. And the first planet they strike is Parmentier.
And Parmentier was chosen very specifically by the machines. It's the closest major league world to the border of synchronized space. But more importantly, it carries immense symbolic weight.
Right. It had been occupied and devastated by the machines for decades. But the human forces recently reclaimed it. They spent years engaged in massive terraforming and cleanup efforts.
Scrubbing toxic waste from the soil, replanting massive global forests, dredging the poisoned rivers. It was the shining beacon of the human recovery effort.
And the governor overseeing this recovery is Rieckhoff Butler. He's a decorated war hero, a prominent member of the famous Butler family.
He's recently taken a leave of absence to stay home in the capital city with his wife, Kohei, and his 11-year-old daughter, Reina.
His father, the supreme commander of the entire human military, Quentin Butler, happens to be visiting the planet when the first wave of machine torpedoes hits the upper atmosphere.
The torpedoes aren't designed to impact the ground and explode, though. They're designed to disintegrate in the stratosphere, using the planet's own weather systems and jet streams to disperse the retrovirus globally.
Initially, the planetary defense grids don't even know what happened. They detect the atmospheric anomalies, but there's no blast. Quentin wants to mobilize an investigation, but Rieckhoff insists his local forces can handle a routine sweep.
So Quentin departs for his military headquarters, and then the viral incubation period ends.
The devastation is absolute. It unfolds exactly as Yorick Thur predicted. The paranoia phase hits the population first. Unexplained riots break out in the rebuilt cities. People turn on their neighbors.
And then the physical symptoms manifest. The hospitals are flooded with people suffering from ruptured tendons and organ failure.
Rieckhoff realizes the horrifying truth of what the machines have done, and he's forced to make a leadership decision that is just unimaginably difficult. He enacts an immediate, ruthless, total planetary quarantine.
He essentially signs the death warrant for himself, his wife, his child, and billions of his own citizens in order to prevent the plague from spreading to the rest of the galaxy.
He commandeers uninfected, single men and women from the military people with no families to return to and stations them in orbital blockade platforms.
Their explicit orders are to shoot down any ship, civilian or military, that attempts to leave Parmentier's atmosphere.
But the retrovirus is so violently contagious that even those isolated orbital stations aren't safe. The sources describe these chilling ghost ship orbital stations.
The crews eventually contract the disease, likely from contaminated supplies, and rather than breaking the quarantine to seek medical help on the surface, they simply die at their posts.
The orbital platforms become floating tombs drifting in space, full of rotting corpses, with their automated defense turrets still active. It's incredibly dark.
And down on the surface, society disintegrates.
Yeah.
Rieckhoff's own wife contracts the disease while praying in their private family chapel.
Rieckhoff carries her to their bedroom, but he is so hyper-focused on trying to govern the collapsing planetary infrastructure, dispatching food rations, managing riots, that he doesn't even realize he has contracted the virus himself.
Until it's too late. Both the governor and his wife succumb. The planetary infrastructure fails completely. The bodies are literally piling up in the streets like cordwood because there is no one left to bury them.
Which brings us to the absolute grim reality of the triage centers. We follow Dr. Mahanda Suk and his medical partner, Raquel Alberto Anirol, inside the hospital for incurable diseases.
They're working 20-hour shifts. The atmosphere is suffocating. Overwhelming smell of harsh chemical disinfectants, the clear plasma breathers they have to strap to their faces.
The transparent biofilms they have to wear over their eyes just to protect their mucous membranes from the airborne particulates. They're drowning in death.
And the deepest psychological toll is their utter medical helplessness. They are brilliant doctors, but they do not have a cure.
They are reduced to palliative care, hydrating patients via 5V, administering basic fever reducers, trying to manage the agonizing pain of the snapped tendons. Fellow doctors and nurses are collapsing and dying right alongside the patients.
But amidst this absolute suffocating despair, Raquella makes a brilliant, world-changing medical deduction.
The breakthrough happens because of a local celebrity, Dr. Hundri Arbar.
Dr. Arbar is famous across the planet for his strict adherence to a philosophy of bodily purity. He famously refuses to consume any artificial drugs, stimulants, or biological enhancements.
He won't even consume the highly popular, expensive off-world spice known as melange. And when Dr. Arbar catches the plague, his liver shuts down and he dies incredibly quickly.
Raquella is utterly exhausted, running on fumes, but her diagnostic mind is still turning. She retreats to the physical records room and starts pulling patient charts, looking for statistical anomalies.
And she begins to notice a very clear, very strange socioeconomic pattern in the mortality rates. The lower classes, the impoverished citizens, are contracting the virus and dying at drastically higher rates than the wealthy noble families.
Now, in a typical historical epidemic like cholera or tuberculosis, you would attribute that to poor sanitation, cramped living conditions, or malnutrition among the poor.
But Raquel realizes that Parmentier is a recently rebuilt world. The basic living standards, the water filtration, the housing density are actually fairly equitable across the social classes.
The only major difference between the poor dying in the streets and the nobles surviving in their manors is access to luxury goods, specifically access to the daily consumption of the spice melange.
Melange is an incredibly expensive commodity. Only the upper echelon of society can afford to incorporate it into their daily diet.
So Raquel looks at the chemical structure of the spice and hypothesizes the molecular science behind why it might be interacting with the retrovirus. The spice melange is a highly complex, rugged protein molecule.
And Mohanda Souk reviews her data and realizes that the spice molecule might be physically acting as a competitive inhibitor in the liver. Let's break down how competitive inhibition works in biology.
Think of the rogue enzyme created by the virus as a specialized lock, and the body's natural hormones as the keys that fit into that lock to be turned into poison.
Right, so if a person consumes melange, the complex spice molecule enters the liver and physically wedges itself into the receptor pocket of that rogue enzyme. The spice blocks the keyhole.
Precisely.
Hmm.
Because the spice molecule is lodged in that receptor pocket, the viral enzyme cannot grab the natural hormones. Therefore, the liver cannot convert those hormones into the deadly compound X.
So it is absolutely critical to understand that the spice is not a cure. If you inhale the retrovirus, the virus is still replicating in your body.
But the spice is a powerful mitigant. It jams the machinery. It prevents the virus from manufacturing the lethal poison, stalling the second fatal stage of the disease.
It gives the body's natural immune system a fighting chance to eventually clear the virus, completely bypassing that horrific 43% mortality rate.
It is a miraculous medical discovery, but it instantly creates a chilling socioeconomic nightmare.
It really does. I mean, look at the ethics of this reality. You have millions of people dying an agonizing death. You finally figure out the exact biological mechanism to save them. But survival is literally locked behind a massive paywall.
The only thing that can save your life is the most expensive luxury item in the known universe.
Right. Imagine you're a working-class parent on Parmentier. You're watching your child suffer a violently high fever, you're listening to their tendons snap, and you know exactly what medicine would save them, but it's a rich man's indulgence that would cost a decade of your wages to afford a single dose.
It creates a brutal socioeconomic filter layered directly on top of a weaponized biological attack. Only the wealthy will survive the plague.
Raquella and Mohandas know they have to broadcast this information to the rest of the League of Nobles immediately, because they know the machine torpedoes are already impacting other human worlds.
Fortunately, a messenger arrives. Vorian Atreides, the supreme commander of the Jihad forces, breaches the quarantine.
He's been flying his heavily modified ship, the Dream Voyager, traveling from world to world, trying to track down the scattered descendants of his own family line.
And his genealogical search leads him straight into the nightmare of Parmentier, where he discovers that Raquella is actually his biological granddaughter.
Vorian literally walks past the dead bodies in the street and enters the highly infectious hospital ward to find her. He operates under the assumption that his own unique ancient immortality treatment protects him from the retrovirus.
Which appears to be true. He begs Raquella to leave the dying planet with him on his ship, but she refuses. She possesses the fierce dedication of a true healer.
She will not abandon her patients, even if she can only offer them comfort. However, she hands Vorian all of her medical data, the charts, and the complete molecular breakdown of the spice breakthrough.
Vorian vows to carry this critical data back to the League Parliament.
So, Raquella has figured out that spice mitigates the virus. But that revelation immediately creates a massive logistical nightmare. If melange is suddenly the only thing standing between humanity and absolute extinction, we have to look at where it comes from.
You can't manufacture it in a lab. You can only extract it from one location. That brings us to the harsh, unforgiving desert planet of Arrakis.
Arrakis is the singular source of melange in the universe. And the extraction of this vital resource is incredibly dangerous and labor-intensive.
We see this danger firsthand through the eyes of Adrian Venport. Adrian is a prominent businessman, the son of the genius Norma Chenva.
And he runs Venki Enterprises, the corporate entity that holds an ironclad monopoly on the off-world spice trade. Adrian doesn't just sit in a boardroom, though.
No, he's out in the deep desert of Arrakis, personally supervising a group of local Zensuni prospectors who are trying to repair a broken mechanical spice harvester.
The environmental description here is intensely visceral. The heat is oppressive, radiating off the dunes. The air is so completely devoid of moisture that it threatens to crack the skin on your face.
And, as they're working, a frantic warning crackles over their short-range comms worm sign.
The sandworms of Arrakis. They are the apex predators of the planet, colossal leviathans that swim through the sand like whales through an ocean.
And crucially, their biology dictates that they are territorial and intensely drawn to rhythmic vibrations on the surface.
Right across the desert basin from Adrian, another crew of spice miners realizes a worm is approaching. They abandon their heavy harvesting machinery and scramble aboard a heavy lifter aircraft.
The lifter's powerful engines are pounding the air, and that heavy, rhythmic vibration acts as a dinner bell, drawing the worm directly toward them.
Adrian and his mechanics are caught in the open. They literally have to freeze in absolute terror. They stand perfectly still on the shifting sand, trying not to breathe too heavily, knowing that a single misplaced footstep could attract the beast.
The scale of the violence is awe-inspiring. The sandworm erupts from the dunes, stretching dozens of meters into the scorching air.
Its massive, cavernous maw is lined with crystalline teeth, spewing sand and spice dust like saliva.
It lunges for the escaping lifter and misses the aircraft by mere inches, but its massive bulk crashes back down onto the dunes, entirely devouring the abandoned metal harvesting machinery as if it were a tin can.
But escaping the worm doesn't mean you survive Arrakis. The heavy lifter manages to gain altitude, but the atmospheric conditions on Arrakis are volatile.
The lifter flies directly into a sudden, localized Coriolis sandstorm, what the locals call a burst event.
The sheer kinetic force of the winds catches the heavy lifter, spins it completely out of control, and smashes the aircraft violently into a range of black rock cliffs. The ship erupts into a ball of orange flame. Everyone aboard dies instantly.
The environment is completely, indiscriminately unforgiving. And that extreme environmental hostility breeds a very specific, deeply hardened culture among the native inhabitants, the Zensuni.
There are nomadic people who value survival and water conservation above all else. But the sudden galactic demand for spice is creating a deep generational fracture within their tribes.
You have two figures representing this divide. First, there's the tribal elder, Ishmael. Ishmael is over 100 years old, his skin is tanned like old leather, and he refuses to wear anything but the traditional stillsuits that reclaim the body's moisture.
He represents the ancient ways, the religious legacy of a legendary historical figure named Salim Wormrider. Ishmael firmly believes that treating the spice as a commercial export is a profound sin.
He argues that selling out to off-worlders will ultimately destroy their austere way of life and inevitably lead to the destruction of the sandworms, which the traditional Zensuni view as sacred instruments of God.
But on the opposing side of the cultural divide, you have Ishmael's stepson, Elhim. Elhim is the newly appointed Naib, the practical leader of the village settlement.
Unlike his stepfather, Elhim spent time off-world when he was a younger man. He has seen the wider galaxy, and he represents a new wave of pragmatic commercialism.
He wears bright, colorful, non-functional clothing as a symbol of his wealth. He argues that the Zensuni people have suffered in grinding poverty for centuries, and they should be the ones to profit from the resources in their own sand.
So Elhim bypasses the elders and directly negotiates with Adrian Venport, bringing purified spice down to the Venki settlements for export.
I look at Adrian Venport standing in the middle of a dusty Zensuni market, haggling over prices, and he operates exactly like a 19th century oil baron standing in the middle of an indigenous territory.
He is utterly arrogant. When a massive, physically imposing Zensuni prospector tries to intimidate him into offering a better price, Adrian doesn't flinch.
He just shoves the man backward and bluffs, threatening that Venki Enterprises will completely cut their tribe off from off-world trade, leaving them to starve and rot in the desert.
And a bluff works. Venport controls the supply chain, which means he controls the purse strings. But consider the terrible burden on Elheim's shoulders.
Yeah, this is a classic sociological trap known as the resource curse. If your people have lived in squalor, constantly losing children to dehydration and exposure in the most brutal desert imaginable, wouldn't you sell your supposedly sacred sand to a desperate galaxy?
Even if the tribal elders call you a blasphemer, it's a tragic compromise.
Yeah.
You want basic comfort for your people. You want access to modern medicine, water purifiers.
You want your children to survive the winter, but the cost is your cultural soul. Ishmael has to sit in the settlement and watch the young men of his tribe get drunk on fermented spice beer, abandoning their religious tenets.
Throwing away their ancient survival disciplines just to chase Venki's money. This dynamic perfectly illustrates how a macro-level conflict, the jihad against the machines, forces devastating microcultural compromises.
The galaxy desperately needs an infinite supply of spice to survive the Omni Plague. That means Venki Enterprises needs to extract vastly more tonnage from Arrakis.
That rapid industrialization accelerates the corruption and fracturing of the Zinsuni way of life. The war touches everyone. Even if a society wants to remain isolated in the deep desert, the economics of survival will drag them into the conflict.
But Arrakis is only half of the logistical nightmare. Parmentier and the other infected League worlds are light years away. Having mountains of spice sitting in a warehouse on Arrakis is completely useless if you can't transport it across the galaxy instantly.
Because conventional sublight space travel takes months, sometimes years. By the time a standard freighter arrives with the spice, the planets will be graveyards.
How do you deliver a physical cure across a galaxy before society collapses? To answer that, we have to move to the industrial shipyards of Venki Enterprises on the planet Kolhar.
And examine the incredible evolving mind of Adrian's mother, Norma Chenva. Norma is universally recognized as the greatest mathematical and scientific genius of her age.
She's already achieved the impossible. She invented the space folding engines. The actual physical propulsion technology works perfectly. A ship equipped with her engines can instantaneously snap from one coordinate in the universe to another,
Bypassing the limitations of linear time and space. But the engines are useless without navigation.
Right. Space is incomprehensibly vast, but it's not entirely empty. It's filled with stars, rogue planets, asteroid belts.
If a ship engages a space-folding engine without a precisely calculated path, it might fold space and emerge directly inside the core of a star, instantly annihilating the vessel and the crew.
In a normal sci-fi setting, you would just feed the coordinates into a supercomputer to calculate the trajectory. But in the Dune universe, because of the Balerian Jihad, thinking machines and advanced computers are strictly outlawed under penalty of death.
So human navigators are basically trying to do cosmic calculus on paper before they jump.
It's like flying a supersonic jet blindfolded through a canyon. You might make it through on pure luck, but the odds are terrifying. The current loss rate for spacefold travel is 10%. 1 in every 10 ships that attempts a jump simply vanishes.
That casualty rate is unacceptable for a mass distribution supply chain. Norma is dedicating every waking hour to solving a problem that borders on the metaphysical. How does a human mind see a complex navigation problem in folded space before the ship actually jumps?
And her methodology for solving this is extreme. She is pushing her biology to the absolute breaking point. She consumes massive, continuous, concentrated doses of melange.
The spice is physically altering her nervous system, and the scene where she finally makes her mathematical breakthrough is one of the most striking cinematic moments in the entire narrative.
Oh, it really is. Norma is locked inside her calculation chamber, a small building situated right in the middle of the heavy industrial shipyards on Kolhar. She is completely absorbed in her work, staring at a glowing electronic sketchboard.
Rapidly mapping out prime numbers, empirical formulas, and theoretical physics. Suddenly, an industrial disaster occurs outside. A massive explosion rocks the shipyard.
Heavy metal components crash to the ground. The sheer force of the shockwave bows the reinforced walls of her building inward. Sirens begin blaring across the facility. Workers are screaming in panic.
And Norma literally does not notice. She does not flinch. She doesn't look up from her screen.
Her focus is absolute. A chemical fire ignites from the explosion and spreads rapidly across her building. The flames consume the exterior walls, the heat shatters the glass windows, and the room fills with thick, toxic smoke.
The fire actually reaches the desk where she is sitting. The flames lick at her body, her clothes burn completely off, her hair catches fire, her flesh is actively blistering and charring, and she does not stop calculating.
Because in that moment of absolute spice-fueled hyperfocus, the pain of the fire is irrelevant. She sees the solution to the universe. Let's delve into the math of what she's actually doing.
She realizes she needs to visualize the universe, not as a grid, but as a folded structure. She uses the galactic coordinates of Arrakis as a baseline, the absolute center point of her mental map.
It makes perfect sense mathematically and narratively. Arrakis is the source of the spice, the single point upon which the survival of the species now pivots. It is the center of the universe.
Once she has Arrakis locked as the anchor, she applies a mathematical concept known to the ancients of Earth as the golden mean, or the golden ratio.
This is represented by the Greek letter phi, which is approximately 1.618. This ratio appears constantly in nature in the spiral of a nautilus shell, the arrangement of leaves on a stem, the shape of galaxies.
Norma realizes that a line segment of spacetime, divided by this specific ratio, can be folded upon itself repeatedly, infinitely, creating a predictable non-Euclidean geometry.
She arranges her massive columns of equations into a physical spiral with Arrakis at the center, and she mentally folds the columns over and over. She cracks the code.
She achieves prescient navigation. She can literally see the safe path through the infinite folds of spacetime. And she solves this navigation problem while she is quite literally on fire.
An emergency response worker in a heavy red hazard suit crashes through the door, knocks the smoldering data pad out of her charred hands, and drags her limp body out of the inferno.
Once they get her outside into the shipyard, the medics attempt to wrap her in a specialized healing blanket. But Norma, regaining consciousness, just pushes the medics away.
And this is where the science fiction leans heavily into biological metamorphosis. Norma doesn't need a hospital. She uses her sheer mental energy, fueled by the massive concentration of spice in her bloodstream, to take conscious control of her own cellular structure.
She rapidly, visibly regenerates her own wrung skin. She rebuilds her damaged cells and charred organs right in front of the terrified medics.
She even casually focuses her mind to make a persistent red blemish on her shoulder, a birthmark she's had her whole life simply disappear. She has achieved complete conscious mastery over her own biology.
But this miraculous evolution raises a profound philosophical question regarding the entire premise of the Holy War.
Right. I mean, think about what we are witnessing. Norma doesn't notice a building exploding around her. She doesn't process the physiological panic of third-degree burns. She can autonomously regrow her own cellular structure.
And she is mapping the infinite non-Euclidean folds of space-time purely in her head. She is functioning exactly like a supercomputer.
Has her massive spice consumption and her pursuit of pure logic fundamentally stripped away her humanity? To defeat the thinking machines, has Norma Chenva turned herself into a biological machine?
She represents the ultimate, terrifying extreme of human evolution forced by the pressures of this war. To outthink a networked supercomputer like Omnius, she had to become a biological processing node.
She voluntarily sacrifices her baseline humanity, her emotional volatility, her connection to physical pain, her familial attachments to become the precise tool the universe requires for survival.
She is no longer a standard human, but she's the only reason standard humans will survive the week.
While Norma Senva evolves in isolation through high-level mathematics and spice ingestion, the everyday citizens of the League are evolving in a much darker way, through sheer, violent fanaticism.
We have to look at how mass trauma fundamentally reshapes human belief systems. Let's return to Parmentier, where the machine plague is still ravaging the planetary population.
The epidemic creates an overwhelming vacuum of hope. When institutions fail and science offers no immediate cure, desperate populations turn to religious extremism.
And stepping into that vacuum on Parmentier is an 11-year-old girl named Raina Butler. Raina is the daughter of the deceased governor, Rikoff.
She contracts the retrovirus, but miraculously, her immune system survives the fever. However, the virus alters her physically. Her post-viral appearance is deeply haunting.
The fever caused her to lose all of her hair. She's completely bald, lacking even eyelashes and eyebrows. She is severely emaciated from the gastrointestinal symptoms.
And her skin takes on this translucent, almost luminous, ghostly quality. She looks like an unearthly skeleton, or perhaps a terrifying angel. And while she was locked in a dark room, delirious with the fever, she experienced a profound vision.
She hallucinates or genuinely communes with, depending on how you view the Dune mysticism, Saint Serena Butler, the martyred figurehead of the jihad.
In this vision, Serena hands the young girl a divine mandate. Raina emerges from her fever, convinced that the plague is not a weapon of the machines, but a righteous scourge sent by God to punish humanity for its enduring reliance on convenient technology.
So this 11-year-old girl, looking like a glowing specter, walks barefoot out of the governor's mansion and down into the ruined, corpse-choked streets of the capital city.
She reaches into a gutter and picks up a heavy iron crowbar. She walks up to a commercial storefront that sells harmless, basic mechanical appliances, things like automated brooms and simple conveniences.
She smashes the plaza window, climbs inside, and just starts methodically, rhythmically pummeling these harmless machines into fragmented debris.
She then marches to an accounting firm and uses the crowbar to violently smash their mechanical calculators.
And because she possesses this unearthly appearance and speaks with such absolute, stony, unwavering conviction, the traumatized survivors of the plague begin to gather around her. They see a prophet.
These are people who have watched their families die horribly, and they need a target for their immense grief. They pick up cudgels, sledgehammers, and metal pipes, and they form a zealous mob around the child.
This is the birth of the martyrists. They are no longer satisfied with fighting Omnius's combat robots on the battlefield. They are dedicated to destroying all technology everywhere.
They view a simple calculator with the same demonic hatred as a plasma cannon. But I want to contrast Reyna's raw, unguided, destructive mob fanaticism with the highly weaponized, institutionalized discipline of the Jinaz mercenaries.
On the tropical archipelago planet of Jinaz, humans are training in brutal conditions to become elite swordmasters. And the deep irony of Jinaz is that these human soldiers are being trained in martial arts by a reprogrammed, captured combat mech named Tyrox.
Kyrox is a fascinating entity. It speaks with a flat, unsophisticated mechanical voice, but its memory core possesses the sum total of all the advanced calculating fighting methods of the machine empire.
The human trainees must fight Kyrox in live combat simulations to prove their reflexes are fast enough to survive on the front lines against Omnius's forces.
And the warrior culture on Jinez is heavily steeped in psychological mysticism. Before a squad is deployed to a war zone, the trainees participate in a solemn ritual.
They gather around a basket filled with engraved pieces of coral called chits. Each chit bears the name of a legendary fallen Jinaz warrior from centuries past.
The trainees reach in and draw a name. They firmly believe that by drawing a specific chit, the martial spirit of that dead warrior reincarnates within their own body to continue the holy fight.
Let's delve into the psychology of this ritual. It is a profound coping mechanism. It is a tool for psychological compartmentalization.
By adopting the persona of an ancient, fearless hero, the young soldier separates their own fragile, terrified human ego from the horrors of the battlefield. It allows them to enter a dissociative state where fear does not exist.
A young, nervous trainee named Istjan Goss reaches into the basket and draws the name of Joel Nere, the legendary mythical founder of the Jinaz fighting style. Istjan is initially terrified by the weight of this expectation.
But we see the psychological tool work when Ishtan deploys to the recently liberated planet of Anru. He drops into a combat zone with his sparring partner, Nar Trig.
Trig is a berserker. He doesn't need a chit. He is just fueled by a raw, passionate hatred for the machines. They are tasked with clearing a warehouse where 3 massive, heavily armed Omnius combat robots are hiding.
The ensuing battle is a display of peak, almost superhuman combat capability. Trig charges in first, fueled by adrenaline. He doesn't even bother to dodge the incoming fire.
He just slides under the machine's legs using a pulse sword to sever the hydraulic joints and an energy dagger to short out the robot's central memory core.
But Ishtan's approach is different. Ishtan actively channels the spirit of Joel Nere. He enters a profound psychological flow state. He stops thinking. He stops planning. He lets his hyper-trained reflexes take over completely.
He fights like water. At one point, a robot swings a massive serrated blade at him. Istjan doesn't panic. He fluidly bends his torso backward, perfectly calculating the trajectory.
The blade just barely traces a shallow line of blood across his chest, a millimeter closer, and he would have been bisected. Using that momentum, he rolls forward and paralyzes the robot with a massive concentrated energy pulse to its central cortex.
And the moment Istjan and Trig disable the combat robots, a surging mob of martyrous civilians armed with pry bars, hammers, and chains floods into the warehouse.
The mob completely swarms the disabled machines, wildly smashing them into unrecognizable piles of scrap metal, screaming religious chants.
Which provides a perfect philosophical mirror for us to examine. Consider the incredibly thin line between a righteous holy crusade and blind mob violence.
Both Reyna Butler's Martyrists and the Jinaz Swordmasters are fiercely dedicated to destroying machines. But Reyna is a traumatized child commanding a mob to smash accounting calculators in a gutter, while Ishchin Goss is a highly disciplined killer dismantling heavy artillery mechs in a war zone. Are they fundamentally different?
The distinction lies entirely in the target selection and the martial discipline. But the psychological root cause is exactly the same. Humanity is actively weaponizing its own deep-seated trauma in order to survive.
The martyrists channel their profound grief into raw, chaotic destruction, while the swordmasters channel their fear into deadly martial perfection.
But both factions are driven by a fanatical, all-consuming hatred that entirely precludes any possibility of peace, surrender, or compromise with the Machine Empire.
Speaking of weaponized history and fanatical belief systems, we have to ask a critical question. How much of the lore driving this jihad is actually true?
To answer that, we shift our focus to the immortals who have been secretly pulling the political strings behind the scenes for a century. We travel to the quiet, rainy ocean planet of Caladan.
Where Supreme Commander Vorian Atreides is having a highly confidential meeting with his young, eager adjutant, Abelard Butler.
Abelard is 18 years old, fiercely idealistic, eager to join the front lines of the military, and crucially, he is the biological grandson of a man named Xavier Harkonnen.
In the accepted historical lore of the jihad, Xavier Harkonnen is universally reviled. He is considered the ultimate coward, a historic traitor to the human race. His name is used as a literal curse word across the galaxy.
The shame of his legacy is so immense that Abelard's parents legally changed their surname to Butler just to avoid the stigma.
But in this quiet room on Caladan, Vorian Atreides reveals the explosive, hidden truth to the boy. Vorian was Xavier's best friend a century ago, and Vorian tells Abelard that Xavier Harkonnen was not a coward or a traitor.
He was actually the greatest hero of the jihad. Xavier willingly sacrificed his own life and reputation to assassinate the Grand Patriarch of the Holy War, a man named Iblis Jinjo.
Because Iblis Jinjo, the beloved political and spiritual leader of humanity, was deeply, irredeemably corrupt. Jinjo was secretly conspiring with the Tulaxa organ farms.
He was orchestrating false flag machine attacks on isolated human colonies, allowing the populations to be slaughtered or captured for genetic harvesting, all to maintain his own grip on political power.
Xavier Harkonnen uncovered this horrifying plot and made the ultimate sacrifice, intentionally crashing the ship he shared with Jinjo directly into a sun to stop the corruption.
And the more shocking part is that Vorian knew this truth the entire time. He admits to Abelard that he stood by and allowed his best friend to be viciously slandered for decades.
He allowed the corrupt Iblis Jinjo to be worshipped as a martyred saint by billions, and he allowed Xavier's innocent family to be hunted and hated as monsters. Why would he do that?
Vorian invokes the concept of the noble lie. He argues that the jihad desperately needed a unified, simple myth.
Vorian tells the boy that if the public discovered their beloved Grand Patriarch was harvesting their own colonies, the Holy Crusade would have instantly collapsed into messy political scandals, civil war, and infighting.
It is the ultimate Machiavellian calculation. Vorian sacrificed historical truth and his closest friend's legacy for the greater good of maintaining social cohesion against the machines.
He fundamentally believed that the human war effort was simply too fragile to survive the truth of its own corrupt leadership.
But is a lie that keeps humanity united actually justified?
It feels like trying to hold up the main structural beam of a massive house using a piece of rotting wood. It might hold the roof up for a few years, but eventually the rot will spread, the truth will come out, and the entire house will violently collapse.
You cannot build a lasting righteous victory on a foundation of calculated propaganda. Vorian's decision to hide the truth ultimately creates the bitter generational hatred between the Atreides and Harkonnen families that will echo in blood for 10,000 years.
And that is the central tragedy of the Dune universe. Almost all of its revered institutions and religious tenets are built on these carefully constructed myths, selective histories, and intensely petty grudges.
Vorian chose pragmatism over integrity. But Vorian isn't the only immortal dealing with the violent fallout of the past. We must also look at the other immortals lurking on the fringes of the war, the Cymex.
The Cymex are a faction known as the Titans, specifically Agamemnon, Juno, and Dante. These were originally human despots who conquered the galaxy thousands of years ago.
To achieve immortality, they surgically remove their own brains and place them inside preservation canisters, which they then plug into fearsome, heavily armed, robotic walker bodies.
They are currently hiding out in the asteroid belts of the planet Riches, trying desperately to rebuild their own independent empire, fighting against both the human jihad and Omnius.
But Omnius constantly hunts them, viewing them as rogue anomalies. The Titans barely survive a massive skirmish involving a fleet of Neo-Cymex, dropping scrambler mines on the machine ships.
Agamemnon, the leader, realizes their position is untenable. They are running out of resources, running out of electro fluid to bathe their brains, and running out of time. They need a new, heavily fortified, isolated base of operations.
So Agamemnon travels to Wallach Ninths to consult with the human traitor, Yorick Thur. Thur, always eager to cause chaos, suggests the Titans attack a place called Hesra. Hesra is the frozen glacial fortress of the ivory tower cogitators.
Now, we must define the cogitators. Much like the Titans, the cogitators are ancient humans who removed their brains and placed them in fluid-filled canisters centuries ago.
However, instead of plugging themselves into weaponized mechs to conquer the galaxy, the cogitators placed their canisters on pedestals in a monastery.
They isolated themselves to do nothing but ponder deep philosophy, mathematics, and the nature of the universe. They claim to be entirely neutral observers in the war between humans and machines.
But they really aren't neutral. They constantly meddle in galactic affairs, offering cryptic advice to whichever side visits them. And Agamemnon absolutely despises them for their perceived arrogance.
So, the Titans launch a brutal, overwhelming military assault on the frozen glaciers of Hesra. And the battle scene is darkly comical in its extreme, almost clumsy violence.
The Titans bring along a squad of Neo-Cymex, fanatical human volunteers who recently put their brains into machines to serve Agamemnon.
One of these volunteers, a damaged Neo-Cymic named Beowulf, completely loses his footing on the ice right at the start of the assault and falls clumsily down a deep glacial crevasse.
Agamemnon watches him fall and seriously considers just leaving him down there to freeze because he's so annoyed by the incompetence.
The Titans storm the ancient citadel. They ruthlessly massacre the peaceful, monk-like attendants who care for the facilities. Strategically, the Titans are there to seize the citadel's electrofluid factories. They need the life-sustaining liquid to keep their own brains from degrading.
But the assault isn't just about tactical resources. It's about incredibly petty, deeply human revenge.
Agamemnon and Juno stomp their massive mechanical walker bodies into the central meditation chamber where the ancient cogitor brains are floating silently on their pedestals.
And the Titans take immense sadistic delight in using their giant mechanical fists to shatter the transparent canisters, violently grinding the ancient philosopher brains into oozing pulp against the stone floor.
It is a stark, bloody reminder that even after 1,000 years of mechanical immortality, the Titans have not evolved past their intensely petty, vindictive human grudges.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of this historical epoch. All of these disparate macro forces, the horrific biological plague sweeping the galaxy, the monopoly of the desert spice, the rise of religious fanaticism, the desperate need for prescient navigation, and the looming threat of extinction, they all violently collide in one single room.
The Grand Parliament Chamber on the lead capital world of Seleucus Secundus. The situation in the Parliament is apocalyptic. Supreme Commander Quentin Butler is standing at the podium, frantically trying to deploy his military fleets to intercept the incoming machine plague canisters.
But the math is impossible. The scourge is already rapidly infecting 15 major planets. The death toll is climbing into the tens of billions.
The medical infrastructure across the galaxy is collapsing. The representatives in the room are panicking, screaming at each other, demanding military intervention that cannot stop a microscopic virus.
And then, the noise in the chamber dies down as a woman named Tisha Chinva stands up to speak. Tisha is the supreme sorceress of the planet Rossack, and she is the half-sister of Norma Chinva.
Tisha is a towering, intimidating figure, fiercely and coldly dedicated to the ultimate victory of the jihad. She commands the room's attention, and she makes a proposal that completely freezes the blood of every politician present.
It is the most chilling moment in the narrative. Tisha calmly and rationally states that because billions of people are inevitably going to die from this retrovirus, the human race is going to suffer a massive genetic bottleneck.
They are going to lose vital, strong bloodlines. Therefore, she proposes that the sorceresses of Rossack immediately institute a massive, mandatory, galaxy-wide selective breeding program.
They will medically evaluate the genetic stock of every plague survivor and strictly dictate who is permitted to breed with whom, ensuring the survival of only the strongest, most resilient human traits.
It is a proposal of unapologetic, state-mandated eugenics. She wants to treat the surviving human race exactly like livestock, husbanding the herd through a brutal winter storm.
Imagine sitting in that parliament chamber right now. The air is thick with panic. You're listening to this powerful woman calmly propose treating humanity like cattle, stripping away the fundamental right to choose who you love or who you have children with.
And the most terrifying part is you aren't immediately shouting her down. The representatives are actually listening to her in stunned silence.
Humanity is backed so far into a corner by this biological weapon that the leaders of the free galaxy are genuinely considering abandoning their basic human rights just to ensure the species survives the week.
It is the definitive turning point where humanity decides it must win the war at any biological cost.
But just before the Parliament can take a formal vote on legally abandoning their own humanity, the heavy doors of the chamber swing open. Vorian Atreides and Norma Chenva stride into the Parliament.
They've just arrived from Kolhar via the Dream Voyager, successfully utilizing Norma's new space-folding mathematics.
They walk up to the podium and drop an absolute bombshell of hope onto the desperate assembly. Vorian announces Raquella's medical discovery from Parmentier. Melange is the key to immunity.
It won't cure those who are already dying, but a daily dose of spice will completely protect the healthy populations from the retrovirus. The room erupts, but the politicians immediately realize the logistical impossibility of transporting it in time.
And that is when Norma steps forward. She announces that she has fully cracked the prescient navigation problem. She has accelerated the production of the space-folding vessels at the Venki shipyards.
They no longer have to rely on slow, conventional engines. They can use her navigators to instantaneously jump heavy freighters to Arrakis, load them with millions of tons of spice, and distribute the cure to every infected world in the League simultaneously.
It is absolute deliverance. It's a breathtaking convergence of plot threads.
The brutal desert spice, the desperate Zensuni prospectors, Venport's corporate monopoly, Norma's fiery mathematics, and Raquella's exhausted medical deduction all synthesize in this one singular moment to save the human race from extinction.
It is a victory, but a victory that comes with an unimaginably heavy cost.
Let's wrap up the massive scope of the history we've covered today in this deep dive. We started by watching a philosophical robot in a velvet robe engineer, a targeted liver virus designed to collapse human infrastructure.
We watched a mathematical genius literally rewrite the laws of non-Euclidean physics while her flesh burned off her bones in an industrial fire.
We saw an 11-year-old luminous child spark a galaxy-wide anti-technology cult with a bloody crowbar, and we witnessed the vital discovery of a highly addictive desert spice that will forever alter the economic and spiritual destiny of the cosmos.
If we pull back and connect all of these monumental events into a final, larger picture, it leaves us with a deeply provocative philosophical thought to mull over.
Throughout this entire era, we have watched humanity fight desperately, shedding oceans of blood to avoid being exterminated or enslaved by the cold, calculating logic of the thinking machines.
But look at the mechanisms of their survival. Look at what humanity had to do to themselves to win.
Norma Tenba had to fundamentally alter her own cellular body and consciousness through extreme chemical use, becoming a living, calculating navigation computer.
Vorian Atreides had to selectively edit history and orchestrate a massive propaganda myth, prioritizing utility over the truth.
Tisha Chemva proposed literally calculating the genetic survival of human bloodlines like data points on a spreadsheet.
And the elite swordmasters train relentlessly to fight with mindless mechanical reflexes completely divorced from human emotion.
Exactly. The ultimate question of the Butlerian Jihad is this. In fighting the machines with such absolute fanatical ruthlessness, did humanity accidentally turn itself into a biological machine?
That is a remarkably heavy question to walk away with.
Yeah.
You strip away your own humanity just to defeat the thing that threatens it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the Butlerian Jihad. Keep questioning the histories and myths you've been taught. And the next time you face a seemingly impossible choice in your own life, think about the people of the League of Nobles, backed against a wall, forced to embrace a dangerous, addictive substance from the deadliest world in the universe, just to buy themselves one more day of survival.